We're going to continue our study through the book of Deuteronomy. And so I encourage you guys to go ahead and open with me to Deuteronomy chapter 24. And as we've been going through Deuteronomy, we've seen a lot of instances of God calling his people to holiness. And when we think about what one of the clearest evidences of a changed heart, we often see that in the way that we treat other people. Again, it's easy to talk about loving God. It's much harder to consistently live your life showing God's compassion, showing his fairness, living in honesty and integrity. Right? It's one thing to say that. It's much different and much harder to actually live that out every day in the general relationships of our lives. And so Deuteronomy 24, and if you hadn't been talking over there, you would have heard me, Jewel. Chapter 24. No, you're. But this is exactly where Moses is wanting to walk us through in Deuteronomy, and he's bringing us into all these everyday life situations. We're looking at through these chapters marriage, lending, right, finances, employment, justice, business practices, how do we care for the vulnerable. And when we first kind of look at Moses laying out these laws, again, they just kind of seem like a bunch of unrelated mass collection of, yeah, do this, don't do that. But they're all tied together by a central truth, which is that people who have experienced God's grace should reflect God's grace. And again, Moses is reminding Israel, you shall remember what? That you were a slave in Egypt. Why? Why does he want them to remember their slavery? Because God didn't want his people to forget where they came from. The memory of Egypt was the memory of mercy. And that memory of mercy was meant to shape how they treated workers, how they cared for the poor, how they conducted their business and pursued justice. And I would say the same is true for you and I. That when we remember the grace that we've received, we become people who want to extend grace to others. And so in this passage tonight, Moses is really going to teach us three important lessons. One, God's people must treat others with compassion. We must pursue justice with integrity. And we must remember God's deliverance while we oppose evil faithfully. Because those who have been redeemed by God should reflect the character of God. So let's start here in Deuteronomy 24, verse 1. If you're with me, say word. Okay. When a man takes a wife and marries her, if then she finds no favor in his eyes because he has found some indecency in her, and he writes her a certificate of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her out of his house, and she departs out of his house, and if she goes and becomes another man's wife, and the latter man hates her and writes her a certificate of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her out of his house, or if the latter man dies who took her to be his wife, then her former husband who sent her away may not take her again to be his wife after she has been defiled, for that is an abomination before the Lord. And you shall not bring sin upon the land that the Lord your God is giving you for an inheritance. When a man is newly married, he shall not go out with the army or be liable for any public duty. He shall be free at home 1 year to be happy with his wife, whom he has taken. No one shall take a mill or an upper millstone in pledge, for that would be taking a life in pledge. If a man is found stealing one of his brothers of the people of Israel, and if he treats him as a slave or sells him, then that thief shall die. So you shall purge the evil from your midst. Take care in the case of leprous disease, to be very careful to do according to all the Levitical priests shall direct you. As I commanded them, so you shall be careful to do. Remember what the Lord your God did to Miriam on the way as you came out of Egypt. When you make your neighbor a loan of any sort, you shall not go into his house to collect his pledge. You shall stand outside, and the man to whom you shall make the loan shall bring the pledge out to you. And if he is a poor man, you shall not sleep in his pledge. You shall restore to him the pledge as the sun sets, that he may sleep in his cloak and bless you. And it shall be righteousness for you before the Lord your God. You shall not oppress a hired worker who is poor and needy, whether he is one of your brothers or one of the sojourners who are in your land within your towns. You shall give him his wages on the same day before the sun sets, for he is poor and counts on it, lest he cry against you to the Lord and you be guilty of sin. Fathers shall not be put to death because of their children, nor shall children be put to death because of their fathers. Each one shall be put to death for his own sin. You shall not pervert the justice due to the sojourner or to the fatherless, or take a widow's garment in pledge. But you shall remember that you were a slave in Egypt, and the Lord your God redeemed you from there. Therefore I command you to do this. When you reap your harvest in your field, and forget a sheaf in the field, you shall not go back to get it. It shall be for the sojourner, the fatherless, and the widow, that the Lord your God may bless you in all the work of your hands. When you beat your olive trees, you shall not go over them again. It shall be for the sojourner, the fatherless, and the widow. When you gather the grapes of your vineyard, you shall not strip it afterward. It shall be for the sojourner, the fatherless, and the widow. You shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt. Therefore I command you to do this. So again, the first thing we want to see this evening is that God's people must treat others with compassion. All right, as we step into Deuteronomy 24, Moses is continuing what does covenant faithfulness look like in our everyday life? And what that phrase twice, verse 18 and verse 22. You shall remember that 18 and verse 22. You shall remember that you were a slave in Egypt. In other words, God is emphasizing, Moses is emphasizing, never forget what God has done for you, and let that be the guiding principle that shapes how you treat others. And so we open this passage with difficult verses concerning marriage and divorce and remarriage. And importantly, Moses is not commanding divorce here. We want to make sure we catch that. What he's doing is he is regulating a situation that already exists within their culture due to human sinfulness. And so the main point of verses 1 through 4 is that a man cannot casually divorce his wife and allow her to marry another and then reclaim her as though she were property. Right? He can't abandon her, let her marry, and then try to take her back. Why? Because marriage, in God's eyes, is a covenant relationship. It is not a commodity to be manipulated. And so even within a fallen world, God is placing protections around human dignity. And he says in verse 5, when a man is newly married, he shall not go out with the army. Instead, what? He shall be free at home 1 year to be happy with his wife. I don't think our country followed that one. But again, this is a remarkable law that's being laid down, right? In a book filled with laws and responsibilities, God is intentionally protecting time for the new marriage, right? He's giving at least a year for the new marriage to be established and to be strengthened. He's teaching us something, right? That he's showing us that God cares not only about justice, but he cares about our flourishing relationships. He wants our marriages to be healthy, to thrive. And then Moses addresses lending practices. In verse 6, he says, no one shall take a mill or an upper millstone in pledge. So a millstone was essential for daily survival, right? That's what was needed because it was used to grind grain into flour. And so if someone was to pledge it, that is, put it up as collateral, if they were to accept that as collateral, then, and that person was to default on their payments, then that loaner is essentially taking away someone's ability to provide and feed for their family. And so God says, do not use someone's hardship. Like they're down so bad that the only thing they can put up is their mill. He says, don't take someone's hardship as an opportunity for exploitation. And we see a similar principle in verses 10 through 13, right? If a poor man gives you his cloak as a security loan, what he says, you shall restore to him the pledge as the sun sets. Why? Because he needs it. The cloak serves as his blanket at night. And so God is teaching his people that even when they have legal rights to something, compassion must be what shapes how those rights are exercised. And then Moses addresses hired laborers. He says, you shall not oppress a hired worker who is poor and needy. Right? Workers, these are often, think, day laborers. They were often dependent upon daily wages for their survival, literally for their daily bread. And so if you were to defraud them, if you were to hold back payment, then you are literally bringing about hunger and hardship and suffering, not just on that individual, but on their family. And so God says, you shall give him the wages in the same day. And there's a warning there, right? He says, you shall give him his wages on the same day. Why? Lest he cry against you to the Lord. God is saying, just as I heard your cries in Egypt, right? Go back and read the beginning of Exodus. And it says the groaning of the Israelites arose into heaven, and God heard their cries. God says, I hear the cries of the mistreated amongst you too. I hear the cries of the vulnerable. The Lord identifies with the vulnerable. He takes injustice personally. In verse 16, he says, fathers shall not be put to death because of their children, nor shall children be put to death because of their fathers. So he's establishing a principle of individual accountability, right? People, there's not communal punishment. People are responsible for their own actions. And this is actually, sounds, in our Western culture in America, we're like, yeah, exactly, duh. But this is a pretty radically different thought process for many ancient cultures, where entire families would suffer punishment for the sins of a single individual. And so again, we see God taking steps, active laws, to protect human dignity and justice. And in this chapter, again, we see repeated concerns now. As this chapter comes to a close, we see repeated concerns for the sojourner, the fatherless, and the widow. And when you think about those three groups, those are three of the most vulnerable people in the society. The sojourner, the wanderer, the foreigner, the fatherless, right? The orphans, the widow, those who have no means of providing for themselves. These are the most vulnerable groups in ancient society, and God is commanding, you shall not pervert justice due to the sojourner or the fatherless. He is putting intentional restrictions in his law to protect them, right? So he's speaking about harvest, right? He says, so when you go to gather your grain, right, you're reaping, you're bringing in the harvest, and some of the grain heads fall to the ground. He says, you're not going to go back and be greedy and pick up those few grain heads that fell. You're going to leave those for the sojourner and the fatherless and the widow. When you gather your olives and you bunch them together, you're not going to go back and grab the excess. When you gather your grapes, same thing. You're not going to scour the vine completely clean. You're going to leave a bit. It's the same thing that we see Ruth doing, right? When you read the book of Ruth, that's how she's surviving. Is she is literally walking behind the harvesters in the field by the mercy of this law that God is establishing. He says, you shall leave them for the needy to gather. And this is not just an idea of charity, which it is, it's good, but it's a built-in system of compassion, right? It's compassionate provision. And Moses tells them, again, the reason why, twice. Remember that you were a slave. Remember where you came from. All right, that's the theological foundation for the chapter. Israel's compassion does not just arise from guilt. Right? It's not just that, well, these people are down bad and I'm doing okay and I feel guilty, let me help them. No, it comes from gratitude. It comes from, I was a slave and I've been redeemed, and so let me show radical compassion and love. The people knew God's people lived in Egypt in slavery for 400 years. They had generations of knowing what oppression looked like, of what helplessness looked like, but they also now know what redemption feels like. And so you put all that together, and God's message is my people are called to treat others with compassion because I have treated them with compassion. And every law is really leading back to that truth, right? Whether it's in our marriages, in our business, in our employment, in our care for the needy, God's people should reflect his mercy. And that truth ultimately points us to Jesus, because Christ is the one who welcomed the outcast. He welcomed the sojourner. He cared for the poor. He defended the vulnerable. He showed compassion to those in need. All right, the gospel reminds us that you and I, too, were once helpless. All right, think of Ephesians 2, verses 1 through 5. It says we were dead in our trespasses and sins. Titus 3, 3 through 5, we were enslaved, but saved by God's mercy. Colossians 3:12, we are to now, therefore, put on compassionate hearts. The church is called to extend the same mercy that we have received. And so the movement in this passage is that God is protecting dignity in relationships. He is restraining the exploitation of the vulnerable. He is defending the workers who are requiring daily bread, daily wages. And he's calling people to remember their own redemption. Remember, you were a slave, but you were redeemed. A people who has received God's mercy must extend that mercy to others. You know, one of the most compassionate people is often someone who remembers what the struggle was like. This is not at all a similar situation to someone who's in a really bad example, but something I think about is I worked restaurants a lot of the time. And so because of that, I tend to try to tip well. I tend to be a little OCD when I'm at the table. And I always knew that I hated cleaning up tables with kids because they were so messy. And so I try to make my table a little cleaner because I was there. I remember that. I sold vacuums door to door, right? And there was a time in my life doing that. And so I tend to have a little bit more compassion towards people who are door to door salesmen, which my wife, is not pleased by, because I'll get tied up talking to them for a while. But it's the idea of when you've experienced something, when you've been there, you're able to empathize and understand where someone else is at. The person who's experienced hardship often notices the needs that other people overlook. And it's because that memory in us produces empathy. And that's what God is trying to trigger for his people. He keeps bringing them back to Egypt so they're never going to forget what it felt like to need mercy themselves. And so a couple things for us to grab this evening. First, remember what God has done for you. Isn't it good to remember what God has done for you? Gratitude is the foundation of your compassion. If you're here and you just feel like, God, I know I'm supposed to love people, but I don't. I just lack compassion in my life. Remember what God has done for you. Nothing will fuel your compassion for others more than having a clear realization of just how much God has done for you. Second, look for opportunities to help the vulnerable. God's people should be known for practical acts of mercy. We ought to be seeking out. God put laws for his people to protect the vulnerable, to intentionally look out for them. I know that those are Old Testament stuff, but I don't think God's heart has changed in that line. We ought to be seeking, we ought to know who the vulnerable people in our society are, who in our community, who the vulnerable are. We ought to be seeking ways to care for them and to help them. Third, exercise your rights with compassion. Just because something is legal, just because something is permissible, does not mean that it's loving. 1 Corinthians 6 says, all things are lawful for me, but not all things are beneficial. Just because something is legal doesn't make it right. And so, yes, I'm not telling you not to claim your legal rights, not trying to lay that down, but do so with compassion. Do so with an understanding towards the other individual. So ask yourself, does my treatment of others reflect the mercy that God has shown to me? Right? Is that true in my life? Second thing I want us to see tonight is that God's people must pursue justice with integrity. Let's look at chapter 25. We're going to be in verse 1. It says, if there is a dispute between men and they come into court, and the judges decide between them, acquitting the innocent and condemning the guilty, Then if the guilty man deserves to be beaten, the judge shall cause him to lie down and be beaten in his presence with a number of stripes in proportion to his offense. 40 stripes may be given him, but not more, lest if one should go on to beat him with more stripes than these, your brother be degraded in your sight. You shall not muzzle an ox when it is treading out the grain. If brothers dwell together and one of them dies and has no son, the wife of the dead man shall not be married outside the family to a stranger. Her husband's brother shall go into her and take her as his wife and perform the duty of a husband's brother to her. And the first son whom she bears shall succeed to the name of his dead brother, that his name may not be blotted out of Israel. And if the man does not wish to take his brother's wife, then his brother's wife shall go up to the gate to the elders and say, My husband's brother refuses to perpetuate his brother's name in Israel. He will not perform the duty of a husband's brother to me. Then the elders of his city shall call him and speak to him. And if he persists, saying, I do not wish to take her, then his brother's wife shall go up to him in the presence of the elders and pull his sandal off his foot and spit in his face. And she shall answer and say, So shall it be done to the man who does not build up his brother's house. And the name of his house shall be called in Israel, the house of him who has had his sandal pulled off. When men fight with one another, and the wife of the one draws near to rescue her husband from the hand of him who is beating him, and puts out her hand and seizes him by the private parts, then you shall cut off her hand. Your eye shall have no pity. You shall not have in your bag 2 kinds of weights, a large and a small. You shall not have in your house 2 kinds of measures, a large and a small. A full and fair weight you shall have, a full and fair measure you shall have, that your days may be long in the land that the Lord your God is giving you. For all who do such things, all who act dishonestly, are an abomination to the Lord your God. So, again, lots of fun verses in Deuteronomy. Again, Moses is now turning from compassion to the need for God's people to show justice and integrity. And again, these themes belong together: mercy, compassion, and justice. Because compassion without justice is just sentimentality. And justice without compassion becomes cruelty. But God calls his people to reflect both his mercy and his righteousness. And so in this section, Moses is teaching that God's people, we got to be marked by honesty and by fairness and by integrity in all aspects of our life. And it begins with legal instructions for disputes. Right? He says there, if there is a dispute between men and they come into court. So this is a situation, right? 2 men, there's a conflict, there's a dispute, they go into the court. And notice the goal of the court is not punitive. It's not punishment. The goal is truth, right? He says in verse 1, the judges decide between them, acquitting the innocent and condemning the guilty. This is revealing the Bible's heart for justice. That justice is not treating everyone the same regardless of truth. Justice is rightly distinguishing between the innocents and between guilt. And the judges were responsible to examine the evidence, to establish facts, to render righteous judgment. And then if punishment was necessary, then it was to be first a measured punishment, and it was to be limited. So in verse 3, he says, 40 stripes may be given. That's a lot, but it's also limited. He says, but not more. This is limit-protected human dignity. Even when punishment was deserved, the offender was not to be treated as less than human. And so God's justice was firm, but it was never cruel. And Moses gives the command right after it, which again, it seems out of place, right? He says, you shall not muzzle an ox when it is treading out grain. And so think about it. As the ox walked over the grain, it would help to separate the grain from the husks. And so God says the animal should be allowed to eat while it's laboring, right? Don't take its feed bag away. If you're going to have it walking around and doing work, okay, let the animal eat. Why? Because it's showing God's concern for fairness, even with animals, which again seems silly, but God, he's consistent. If God cares about fairness toward an ox, how much more do you think he cares about fairness towards people? The Apostle Paul would say in in 1 Corinthians 9:9 and in 1 Timothy 5:18, that this is how God applies the similar principle to ministry. Right? That there's a broader principle at play, that those who labor should not be exploited. And the next section, he's looking at Levitic marriage. Right? He says if a man died without children, his brother was to marry the widow and raise up offspring in his brother's name. And so the law here is protecting the widow, right? Because her husband has died, and that was her provider. And so there is no one to provide for her. It's protecting her from destitution. It's protecting the family line from disappearing. And it's protecting an inheritance within the community from being destroyed, right? Because that family no longer exists. In the ancient world, a widow without children could face tremendous hardship. And so this law was God's concern for responsibility, for family care, for covenant faithfulness. It's not merely about inheritance. It is love expressed through responsibility. And the next law involves another unusual situation where two men are fighting, right? And so again, we don't got to focus on the details, but the larger principle is that God's people must conduct themselves honorably and appropriately, even in the midst of conflict, right? Even when it comes to a fight, there is a fight amongst equals, if you will. There is a way in which we are to fight, right? There are underhanded tricks that we're not supposed to engage in. Moses is also teaching that when it comes to areas of conflict, that integrity matters in that sphere of life as well. And so what we see being emphasized in this section is condemnation of business practices that are dishonest, right? There's a clear condemnation against dishonesty, a clear condemnation against those who are seeking to exploit. And he says there, you shall not have in your bag two kinds of weights. And so merchants often use scales and weights in commerce. We still have some of those when we get fruit in the grocery store, right? And so they would have they would keep one weight for buying and then another weight for selling. And so the weights would not be equal. And so they would buy stuff for less and then they would sell stuff for more, and they were cheating people for personal gain. Now, to everyone else who's unaware of the situation, everything seems above the board, right? And no one else is aware that these scales are cheated. But God knows. God sees the deception. And he says in verse 16, for all who do such things, all who act dishonestly, are an abomination to the Lord your God. That's pretty strong language. God cares about fairness, right? And out of all the things that we've talked about, right, not the idolatry, not the sexual immorality, dishonest business practices are what God calls an abomination, right? Why? Because dishonesty reflects a heart that values personal gain more than truth and righteousness. And God cares about integrity. He cares about it at church, at home, in the marketplace, and everywhere else. And so when you put these truths together, the message that God is delivering is that my people must pursue justice with honesty and fairness and integrity. Whether it's in the courtroom or the workplace or the family or the business, we are called to reflect God's righteous character. Integrity is not something that you can turn on and turn off depending on the situation. It's a way of life. And ultimately, when we think of integrity, we think of Jesus. He was the one who was perfectly righteous. He was the righteous judge, the one who never showed favoritism or partiality, the one who never twisted the truth, the one who never acted unjustly. And through Christ, believers are called to live lives of integrity. Colossians 3:23, work heartily as for the Lord. Ephesians 4:25, put away falsehood. Philippians 2:15, be blameless and innocent. Because we belong to Christ, we should be people whose word can be trusted. And so what we see Moses laying out in this section is that justice must be fair and measured. Laborers must not be exploited. Families must act responsibly. Business dealings must be honest. Integrity, it must reflect the character of God, the integrity that we live with. Because a people who belong to a righteous God must reflect that righteousness in our justice and our integrity in every area of life. Again, when you think of like a new building that's been someone, you go in new construction and someone has a new building they've put up. At first, that thing might look flashy and nice and it's brand new, but what happens if the foundation's not right? Right? It looks good. There's a nice glamour on it, but eventually, it's going to fail. Those cracks are going to appear. Yeah, it happens. It happens a lot. If the foundation is not right, doesn't matter what you put on top. It's going to go wrong. And the same is true of integrity. Many people can maintain an appearance for a season, but character is revealed when nobody's watching. And so integrity is doing what is right because it's right, even when dishonesty would be a lot easier. And so a couple things for us to grab here. Be honest in all your dealings. Be honest. Whether it's at work and finances, your taxes, relationships, let truth characterize your life. And secondly, treat others fairly. God deeply cares about how we use our authority and our influence and our responsibility. He cares about how we treat other people, treat others fairly. Third, remember that integrity is an act of worship. Every honest decision is an opportunity for you to reflect the character of the God you serve. And so every time we do that, we are giving worship back to God. So ask yourselves, would the person who knew me best describe me as a person of integrity? Would the person who knows you best, would that be how they describe you? If not, that's something I would consider laying before the Lord. Just say, God, what do I need to change? How do I need to live differently? Because I want to reflect your character. And lastly, we want to see that God's people must remember God's deliverance and oppose evil. Look at verse 17. Remember what Amalek did to you on the way as you came out of Egypt, how he attacked you on the way when you were faint and weary, and cut off your tail those who were lagging behind you, and he did not fear God. Therefore, when the Lord your God has given you rest from all your enemies around you, and the land the Lord your God is giving you for an inheritance to possess, you shall blot out the memory of Amalek from under heaven. You shall not forget. And so Moses is closing this section by calling God's people to remember a pretty painful moment from their past. He says, remember what Amalek did to you on the way as you came out of Egypt. So again, throughout Deuteronomy, Moses is repeatedly telling Israel to remember, right? Remember Egypt. Remember God's salvation. Remember God's provision in the wilderness. Remember God's covenant. Remember God's faithfulness. But here he's telling them, remember the opposition, right? Remember the enemies you faced after God delivered you. Why? Because again, memory is essential to faithfulness. What we remember shapes how we live. And the events Moses is referring to, you could check back sometime in Exodus 17, but it's shortly after Israel has left Egypt, the Amalekites attacked them, right? And notice how Moses describes the attack. He says, he attacked your rear ranks, all who were faint and weary among you. So they weren't just attacked, but this was an ambush. And they didn't ambush the strong, they ambushed the weak. They attacked the rear of this long line of civilians. And so they attacked the weak, the exhausted, the vulnerable. They preyed upon those who were least able to defend themselves. We call this a war crime, probably. And Moses says, on top of that, and he did not fear God. Right? And that's ultimately the real issue. All the action we just described is coming from that singular statement, is that he did not fear God. That's the real issue. The attack of the Amalekites revealed a heart that was in rebellion against God. The Amalekites were not simply opposing Israel, they were opposing the purposes of God. And so in verse 19, he says, therefore, when the Lord your God has given you rest, right, once you're settled in the land, once you enter the promised land, and you've entered a time of safety, remember Amalek, and remember God's judgment against them. And so this ought to raise an important question for us, which again, why is remembering so important? Why remember the wrongs? Aren't we supposed to show mercy? Aren't we supposed to show compassion? Aren't we supposed to show grace? Why is remembering important? Because God's people, again, we're prone to forget. Once life becomes comfortable and once the battles are over and once the blessings increase, it becomes easy to forget where we've been. It becomes easy to forget all the things that God has done for us. It becomes easy to forget that danger still exists. And Moses knows that spiritual forgetfulness will often lead them to spiritual compromise. And the passage is not meant to be one of personal revenge. Israel's not being told to hold a grudge, but they're being reminded that there is persistent rebellion against God, and it cannot be ignored forever. Amalek became a symbol of determined opposition to God's purposes. And the issue was not what Amalek did one time. The issue is that they continued in hostility towards God and his people. Throughout Scripture, Amalek becomes the picture of persistent evil that stands against the Lord. And so God's people are being taught that we must never become comfortable with what God calls evil. Compassion and grace do not mean indifference towards sin. There are times when faithfulness requires resisting what opposes God's truth. And so we have to remember that God's saving work, all the things that he's done, and as we remember that, remain faithful in the face of opposition, because there is an enemy, and he's at work in this world. Right? It's not a rest time. It's not peacetime. It's a battle time. We're at war. Memory is what fuels our perseverance in the midst of the fight. Because when we forget God's faithfulness and his deliverances and his promises, that's when we become vulnerable to compromise in our life. But when we remember, that's when we're strengthened and we remain faithful. And so ultimately this passage again is pointing us to the greater deliverance, not just of God in Egypt, but the greater deliverance of Jesus on the cross. Just as Israel was delivered from Egypt, believers have been delivered from sin and slavery to sin, from death. We've been delivered from the kingdom of darkness. Just as Israel faced enemies after their redemption, Christians today still face spiritual opposition after our salvation, right? Newsflash, your life does not get easier when you come to Jesus. It might get harder. The New Testament repeatedly calls believers to remember, right? Paul in Ephesians 6, right? Stand firm against spiritual forces of darkness. 1 Peter 5, 8 and 9, resist the devil. 2 Timothy 2:8, remember Jesus Christ. The Christian life is sustained by remembering what God has done for us in Jesus. And so God is calling his people to remember. Amalek represents that opposition and that resistance against God. And our forgetfulness is what leads to our compromise. But if we're to be faithful, then that requires us to resist evil. It requires us remembering God's deliverance in order to strengthen our obedience. But a people who remember God's saving work will remain faithful in the face of opposition. Again, there's lots of war memorials that exist for a reason. And we have a lot of different war and historical places around here, which I've been to a couple. I want to go and visit some more. But there's a ton of history around this area. But war memorials exist for a reason. People understand that forgetting comes naturally. And so nations build memorials because they know that future generations are going to forget the past. And if they do, then they're doomed to repeat it. And so the memorials exist to protect memory. And that same principle, just as much as it applies to those who fought in World War II and seeking to remember what they did and what they fought for. It applies spiritually to us. When we forget God's faithfulness, we become vulnerable to fear and compromise and spiritual drift. And so what do we do with this? A couple things as we close. Regularly remember God's deliverance in your life. Rehearse the gospel often. Often. Preach the gospel to yourself every day. Every day. The gospel is not just something, it's not the ABCs to the Christian life. It's not the doorway. It is the A through Z. Right? It's the diving board into the bottomless pool of the gospel. And so preach the gospel to yourself daily. Secondly, remain vigilant against spiritual compromise. Opposition to God's truth still exists today, and believers are going to be tempted towards that. But we must remain firm, remain vigilant, resist the devil. And lastly, let God's past faithfulness strengthen present obedience. The God who delivered you is the God who will sustain you. And so ask yourselves, am I actively remembering God's faithfulness, or am I slowly drifting into spiritual forgetfulness? Will you all pray with me? God, I thank you for this time this evening to open your word. God, I thank you just for your mercy and your grace. Lord, the compassion that you show on us, God, we do not deserve it. We have not earned it, God. We would be lost without you, Lord. But you sent your Son to die in our place, to give us life. Lord, I pray would we never forget that. Lord, every day would we just wake up in awe that we get to live and follow you. Lord, I pray that you would help us just to live with an ever-increasing awareness of your love and your compassion and your grace. Just how much you've given to us, that it would overflow within us into our relationships with others. God, I pray, would you help us to be faithful by your Spirit to live lives of integrity and justice, and would you help us to stand firm against evil here in this world? We ask this in the name of Jesus. Amen. Amen. Thank you guys for coming, and I'll see you Sunday.